Okay.
Yes. Welcome you all. This is Ahmet, Faruk, Aysan from Istanbul Şehir University. I will be moderating this session. We have very distinguished speakers today, and we will be talking about a very important topic of environmental finance, building back better, which role for environmental finance in the new normal post-COVID-19 is the title of the webinar. We are very delighted to host this event because after COVID-19, there are lots of webinars going on. But one thing for sure is the following. The interest rates are low throughout the world. It was like a new normal after global crisis back in 2008, but we have new normal after COVID-19. And it is very likely that the interest rates will remain low for an extended period of time. And under these conditions, when the prices are lower for the capital, other properties of the investments will be much more important. And COVID-19 situation is actually showing us if we don't care enough for environment, if we don't care about the impact investing, if we don't care about the sustainability issues enough, then all of a sudden, as it happened to be with COVID-19, we could be stuck at home. Our daily operations would be affected, economy is affected, and so on. So it is better to take precautions and to ponder more about the environmental finance, to ponder more about sustainability issues. And that's why I'm very happy to be a moderator in this session, because we are going to be talking something which was already important, but we couldn't appreciate it enough probably so far. But I hope after COVID-19, we will appreciate the environmental issues, environmental finance, impact investing, sustainable finance more. And we hope to contribute in that discussion. And definitely these issues are discussed, but I hope and I believe that we need to discuss this even further. We have to increase the awareness for the policymakers, for the development finance institutions. And this is especially important for ADFIMI, because ADFIMI is the Association of Development Finance Institutions. And the development over time, as you know, is changing. At least approaches to development is changing. In the past, it was just industrialization. It was just the national progress. But right now, we better realize that we are in the same boat, and we are throughout the world. A small virus is affecting our lives. So we have to have some sort of a collective effort to have more concern about environment. So, and it's good to see that ADFIMI is taking such a role, taking such a lead to further these discussions and to have policy recommendations. I'm an academic and I talk forever, as you see, but today we have very distinguished speakers. Mr. Hervé Barois, Mr. Ali Benryane, and Mr. Fouad Bergigui is with us, and they have been in the field for extended period of time. They know the topic academically, and they are also practicing the environmental finance in their occupations. So I am looking forward to hear more from them. So I will try to keep it short. And I would like to go directly to questions. I guess there is no need for further explanations about our speakers. They are quite well known in their fields and in practice. So just for the sake of saving time, let me start with Mr. Hervé. I prepared some questions. We prepared some questions on the issues. I would like to start from biodiversity issues, because you are at BioFin. Mr. Hervé, what do you think? How are the biodiversity finance solutions disrupting the way developing countries are managing their natural capital? If you can provide us some examples, some good examples from the field, that would be very much appreciated as well. Or you may start with an introduction as you wish. I mean, just to save the time, I got into the questions. But again, thank you very much for being with us. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the introduction, and good afternoon, good evening to all the participants, depending on where you are in the world. My name, as it was already indicated, it's Hervé Barois. I work for UNDP, which is the United Nations Development Program, and I'm a technical advisor for this BioFin, which means a Biodiversity Finance Initiative, which is a global project, which is funded by Germany, European Union, the Swiss, Norway, and EU. So in the introduction, the professor has indicated environmental finance, but I will focus a bit more on biodiversity finance. And I think the best way to introduce biodiversity finance is first to have a common understanding of what is biodiversity. Usually biodiversity is not very well understood as a concept. But if you look at the definition provided by the Convention on Biological Diversity, biodiversity is very broad. It includes its life on Earth, its nature, and it's the foundation of ecosystem services to which human well-being is linked. So it's really nature around you. Its biodiversity includes the air that you breathe, include the water that you drink, include the food that you eat. All of this rely on biodiversity. Biodiversity contributes as well to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Biodiversity helps you to provide clean water. Life on land and life below water, it's biodiversity as well. Every sector of economy are somehow very reliant on biodiversity. For example, biodiversity in the forest sustains the livelihood of 1.6 billion people around the world. So it's really, really important. Forests provide medicine for 4 billion people worldwide. 5.5 billion people depend on forests on their drinking water. Forests provide more than a third of our climate mitigation option. Agriculture as well is biodiversity and sustain 1.3 million livelihoods around the world. Oceans sustain 1.6 billion people around the world. So you can see that nature and biodiversity, it's really the foundation of our economy. There is some study provided by OECD and the World Economic Forum that highlight the fact that 50% of the world GDP it's moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. That represents 44 trillion US dollars. That's a massive value. And usually these values are not accounting anywhere, are not taking into consideration by the countries, are not taking into consideration by businesses. There is as well estimate of the value of ecosystem services, which was estimated by different organizations. You got different estimates, but today, the latest, what was produced last year, it's around 125 trillion to 140 trillion per year, which is 1.5 times of the global GDP. So you can see nature, biodiversity, it's huge in terms of value, but it's not accounting for in most cases. But what's happened? Since last year, we had a report produced by the World Economic Forum, by IPBES, and everybody has identified that there's a massive biodiversity loss, and it was a major threat to global economic prosperity. It was before the COVID-19. They flag in their report that we already lost 1 million species worldwide. We lost 10% of wilderness in 20 years. We lost 75% of the insects that are responsible for the fertility of the soil, for pollination, which has direct impact on economic production sector, on the agriculture sector. We will have maybe more plastic in the ocean than fish biomass by 2050, if we carry on like this. And 90% of the global fisheries are fully or overexploited and about to collapse. If we carry as usual before the COVID-19, if we produce more biodiversity lost, we will increase damage on flooding, climate change will increase, disease will emerge like the COVID-19. The COVID-19 is really an issue that's related to biodiversity degradation because it's a disease that jumps from wildlife to human through the domestic animals. So it's really linked to biodiversity degradation. We will have, if we carry on destruction of biodiversity, we'll have issues with clean water, some country, loss of crop pollination, decline in productivity, and other risks. So we cannot carry on the same way. We need to change the way we operate.
Thank you, Mr. Hervé.
No, well, yeah, sure, yeah. So it was the overall of what is biodiversity and the relation to the economy. Yes, please, yeah.
Thank you very much for a good introduction. Let me move to Mr. Ali. Mr. Ali, also, could you talk about your recent endeavor? I know that you are giving some consultants on these issues, and I would like to specifically ask you, how can sustainable finance address the finance gap for SMEs? Because, I mean, in this under COVID-19 situation, apparently SMEs are even more affected, and many countries have adopted certain policies in favor of SMEs, but still, I mean, they are the most hardly hit segment of the society for sure. And this is especially the case for developing countries. SMEs in developing countries seem to be affected more because of the lack of or insufficient social links. And how can they contribute effectively for sustainable development?
Yes, thank you. Thank you to my colleagues and Hervé for this great introduction to the topic, and to ADFEMI for hosting us, to you, Professor, as well for moderating this very interesting webinar. And indeed, as you said, SMEs are quite a building block of local economies, worldwide economy actually, in terms of developing countries. They're heavily impacted, that's true, but they are also responsible for quite a lot of environmental impact. So first, just to go back a bit, in terms of sustainable finance, and what we mean by that is that to have as much environmental, social, and governance considerations than the investment and economic considerations, because basically what it means is we need to come down to having a number of conditions prior to providing a grant, a loan, or even equity investment in any company or entity, and that ensures that it's sustainable for itself, the stakeholders, and environment in general. So before, when we talk about sustainable finance, before, most investors, they used to base the investment decisions based on financial indicators and econometrics. At sustainable finance investment, it goes beyond the account balance and profit margins. It targets real indicators of change with the social and environmental impact that can be quantified and measured. So for small and medium-sized enterprises, for SMEs, they're one of the drivers of economic development, of innovation and employment, and that's especially true in developing countries. So having a strong SME presence and SME growth in a country is usually a pretty good indicator of positive growth. But for most businesses, access to finance and capital are very much necessary to launch and grow their economic and commercial activities. And that goes for any sector. So the situation is that SMEs, they still do not have enough access to finance to be able to grow as they should. And basically, when you look at different studies, there was one, I think the most recent one I had access to was SME Finance Forum, one that shows that there are over 130 million SMEs in developing countries that still severely lack access to finance, which represents a missing gap of over $5 trillion US dollars, which is huge. So that's what we identify as the finance gap. So that gap, we also call it the missing middle in terms of private sector finance, because it's between traditional small-scale finance, like microfinance, and which has been heavily developed in most countries, but with very mitigated results, and also the traditional private finance that usually bank offers to individuals or larger companies, which so basically the SME need comes into that middle. That's where the gap is. And it's even more worrying if you consider it from a gender perspective, because we know that around maybe between 20-23% of all of those SMEs are owned by women in developing countries, but they represent a third of the financing need. So basically what it shows is that women-owned companies are more underfinanced in general. So the question is, how can this finance gap be bridged, and how can we contribute to sustainable development in the post-COVID-19 era? So to answer that, when we look at the socio-economic weight that these SMEs have in developing countries, we already said that SMEs, they play a key role in national economies around the world by generating employment. They have added value and contribute to innovation, but they are also central to the efforts of achieving environmental sustainability and encouraging a more inclusive growth. So in terms of employment, for example, they account for about 45% of the total jobs on average in emerging economies, in emerging countries, and about 35% of the GDP. And also, of course, the important aspect about innovation is that they represent about 20% of all new patents worldwide. So, and this, of course, this is just what we have in reports. We don't even take into account informal businesses. And we know that they are quite common in developing countries. So those figures could be even higher if some of these informal businesses became formal SMEs, and that can happen with proper financing. So from an environmental standpoint, the impact and footprint of these SMEs, so individually, it's relatively low compared to bigger companies, but the aggregated impact of all these numbers and the disseminated presence worldwide, it makes the impact much more than the larger companies. And that's especially true in the manufacturing sector, because the large number of SMEs, they operate and they play a big part in the consumption of resources, air and water pollution, and the generation of waste. So basically, bridging that gap, finding ways to provide financing for these types of SMEs will have huge consequences for the environment, but also, as we saw it, for many different socio-economical aspects on the populations directly in those developing countries. We can go more in detail about different types of financing solutions, but overall, that's kind of the gross answer to why it's important to bridge that missing financial gap and make financing more sustainable.
Thank you, Mr. Ali, for the good introduction also to the topic, because if we don't understand the situation of the SMEs, we cannot find solution for their financial help. Actually, I would like to ask a very similar question to Mr. Fouad. Sustainable development goals are with us, and probably the COVID-19 will bring us a new interpretation of how to achieve these sustainable development goals. I would like to hope that there will be even more emphasis given to the sustainable development goals after COVID-19, because we are all in the same ship, same boat for sure. How do you see the environmental finance will be helping, especially after COVID-19? How the environmental finance might help to achieve sustainable development goals? And it will be great if you also kindly introduce yourself, because I know you already and your success. And I know that you are in the field for a long period of time, relatively long period of time. You are still young, for sure. But it will be great to start with an introduction of what you do and then move into the financial gap, please. Thank you, Mr. Fouad. The floor is yours.
Environmental finance has a tremendous role to play, so countries, especially developing countries, can actually be on track towards achieving their SDG targets and meet the deadline by 2030. First of all, let me thank you very much, Professor Dr. Ahmet, Faruk, Aysan. Thank you so much for having me today on this webinar. Let me also express my very special thanks and appreciation for the colleagues from ADFIMI, the organizers of the webinar. And the topic, Building Back Better in the New Normal, is really a timely and great topic to discuss among professionals and practitioners on the field. And I'm very happy to be in this panel today with brilliant minds such as Hervé Barois and Ali Benryane. As you mentioned, so basically we're living in a very, very special moment. It's an era-defining moment. It's a tipping point. It's a transition to the new normal, from business as usual to the new normal. So within these exceptional times, there might be no going back to the old new normal as we once knew it before COVID-19. We are in these uncharted territories of the new normal. They are like full of uncertainties, but however, at the same time, they're like positive signs actually, because the pandemic was somehow this wake-up call for many of us so we can get it right, so we can get our house in order. Because so far what's happening today is that it's just a feedback loop that is still in us. We have been trespassing natural boundaries. It's the results of our consumption patterns. It's the results of our lifestyles, which have been driving deforestation. We have been actually causing the loss of habitats and the emergence of zoonotic diseases, as we have seen with COVID-19. So that can be transmitted, from animals to human. This is the tipping point that is pushing us today to rethink the way we would like to have the Anthropocene with the footprint of human beings and reboot the way we do business as usual. So to answer your question, let me first start from development finance before talking about environmental finance. As you rightly mentioned, we were already in short supply. Pre-COVID-19, we were in short supply. There was a scarcity of financing for development, and a lot of developing countries were actually struggling to find out the right financial mechanism so they can finance their development efforts towards achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, by 2030. We only have 10 years to go to the deadline, and there is still lot to be achieved. So basically we started from what we call the funding chasm. There was a big financial gap. Public finance was not enough. ODA money, official development assistance, was not enough. So there was a huge need for the private sector to step in so they can pitch in their contributions and help actually fill in the financial gap that we had. So far, as of today, we haven't seen the true or the real impact of the pandemic. If when you throw a stone to the water, you have these ripple effects. So we haven't seen the ripple effects reaching our shorelines yet. We're still living in this bubble because we still have these packages of different economic stimulus injected in different economies. So we haven't really faced yet the true impact of COVID-19 on our economies. And the main issue is that this crisis can reverse the hardly achieved, the hardly won development gains over the last decades. We have already seen initial studies actually looking into the impact of the crisis on the 17 SDGs across the SDGs. As you know, the SDGs have this interlinked nature. When we moved from the MDGs to SDGs, we decided to break silos and to have a holistic approach so we can move together, and use this integrated approach. So the interlinked nature of the SDGs makes it that we are really in a situation where we can lose all the most of the hardly achieved development gains over the last decades. If you look at the achievements in terms of food security, in terms of biodiversity conservation, in terms of gender equality. As you have seen, there was a spike recently during the lockdown of domestic gender violence, for example. And again, so the whole package makes it that we are in a situation where we need to reinvent the way we do business, where we need to reconsider, redefine, reimagine the future all together, so we can make sure that we stay on track to achieve the SDGs. Otherwise, there is a high risk we're going to be missing actually the challenge of meeting our targets by 2030. And of course, if we move on to environmental finance, part of development finance, environmental finance can play a very critical role as part of the solutions. We can revive our economies back and put countries on track to meet their SDG targets. I think I will not repeat what Hervé rightly pointed out based on the work of Biofin on the ground. So basically, natural assets are virtually the basis to every economic activity. Yet, the issue is that in we have scarcity of financing, but also we have unprecedented challenges that the environment is facing today. There is an increasing pressure on environment and ecosystems in general, and we need to come up with the right mix of financial instruments so we can protect the environment and sustainable use of natural resources, encourage its sustainable use. At the same time, make sure that these financial instruments are not standalone solutions, but they're also like part of the overall stimulus packages that governments are injecting within their domestic economies, for instance. So the issue that Hervé mentioned is really very important. I think this is the key takeaway from this introduction from my side, is that if I can put it in those terms, there are like a lot of issues we have in natural capital, and the market can be a psychopath. Why is that? Because conventional financing or like financial accounting systems, they fail to capture the economic value or the value in general of natural capital. If we talk, for example, about ecosystem services, if we look at provisioning services, the food we buy, we know how to price tag, to put a dollar tag or a dollar price on actually on 1 kilo worth of banana, for example. But this is not everything. I mean, because if we think about the fresh air we breathe, if we think about the clean water we drink, if you think about all these services provided for free by nature, we don't pay the value of water, for example. We don't pay for the value of clean air. What about pollination? I mean, without the pollinators, there will be no agricultural production. There will be no actually pollination within our landscapes and so on. So biodiversity, ecosystems, services will be impacted. What about recreational services? Forests are not just good to be cut down and transformed into wood and furniture in our houses. It's also the place for a variety of services like physical, spiritual, and cultural activities we conduct. So as long as the market, as long as the financial stimulus that we have in the market fails to capture the value of nature of ecosystem services, we will be short of striking the right balance, the right deal between having profitable and sustainable economies and preserving their natural assets, which will be definitely required on the long run for these very economies to function.
Thank you, Mr. Fouad. Actually, let me take where you left your speech, and let me take it to Mr. Hervé. In the past, the life was relatively simpler. I mean, when we think about the development finance, it was you support the government built big factories, and all parts of the society develop at the same time. But over time, things get complicated as we discuss the issue of environmental finance. The sustainability issues started to be discussed more, especially after 1980s. And we now see it is not just about environment, but it is also more specific type of financing might be needed because we have much more specific targets. And one of them is the biodiversity. And to achieve biodiversity, definitely finance is also needed to achieve the biodiversity. The society needs to be protected. The poor peasants will not be going after their immediate short-term benefits. How do you see this? And also we at the same time see impact investing, and it's a kind of an impact investing. And what we are trying to achieve is to increase the biodiversity such that later on we will have more antibiotics, we will be more immune to certain diseases later on. Mr. Hervé, how do you see that biodiversity can play a role after COVID-19? What sort of policy recommendations or what sort of recommendations could you give us on achieving biodiversity, and what role the finance can play? Probably we may name it as biodiversity finance. What could be done for the biodiversity finance? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the great question. Just one step back. Before COVID-19, globally, some estimate shows that the world, the public sector, private sector, the donors, they were spending around less than $100 billion a year to conserve biodiversity. If you compare this value with the service provided by biodiversity that I mentioned earlier in my introduction, which is $140 trillion, you can see that investment needed to protect biodiversity and to ensure economic prosperity was not sufficient, and it will always lead to biodiversity degradation, and then it will not be guarantee sustainable development. All right. On the other hand, you could see that government was given a lot of subsidy, and subsidy harmful to biodiversity, like fossil fuel subsidies, pesticide subsidies, chemical fertilizer subsidies. The value of a subsidy provided worldwide is estimated at $500 billion a year. So you can compare this number, this $500 billion a year, to the 90, which is already spent on biodiversity. You can see that just by reforming the subsidies, all right, make sure that any subsidies you provide are not harmful to the biodiversity, you will save a lot of money and you will ensure net gain for biodiversity. So this is the COVID-19 because we restart from zero, we rebuild the world with new system. It's an opportunity to make sure that new incentive will not be harmful to biodiversity and will contribute to positive gain to biodiversity. But just doing this, we will already improve the biodiversity outcome in the future and improve the lifestyle of people in the world and the businesses in the world. It's easy to say, but it's very political. It has social impact as well. And this, it will need to redirect the type of business model. In the future, we will need to develop business model which is based on nature. It's what we call nature business solution, all right? But take into consideration the biodiversity, the natural capital, and in a sustainable way. And by that way, if all businesses generate co-benefit, we will be able to mobilize additional resources from the private sector. We need to all push in the same direction. Government by reforming harmful subsidies, private sector by injecting money in nature-based solution and businesses. And thirdly, the third main direction is to be more effective on what we're doing, all right? So it's not only to increase the resources, but to improve the way we operate, to reduce the cost and effectiveness and efficiency in businesses, in the public sector. For biodiversity conservation, it's another strategic point to develop in the after COVID-19.
Thank you for pointing out the strategic points. Another strategic point is the impact investing more generally. And I guess we will be discussing more of this. And I would like to come back to Mr. Ali. In terms of financing the green, how can impact finance make trade and the trade of commodities, for example, more sustainable? Because the commodities are traded widely, even in times of COVID-19, we have observed that world is quite well integrated, and this sort of integration somewhat protect the environment as well, because countries might pressure the other countries to be more environmentally friendly, and they can even extend their financing accordingly. What is your say on how the impact finance can affect the trade of commodities, trade in general, probably, to make it more sustainable?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Faruk Aysan, for this interesting question. And I think it falls in line with what my colleague Fouad was saying about the financing gap that I spoke about, but also it's can be one of the answers that our colleague Hervé was talking about as well, how to develop this nature-based solution and how to make sure that the ecosystems are more valued and that all the commodities. You mentioned the trading of commodities, especially agricultural commodity, which is one of the ecosystem services that nature provides to us to consume. How can it be made better through impact financing? So one of the reasons why the trade of commodities is an important aspect to consider, it's because it has a huge environmental impact from the production and transport and the consumption, of course, of these commodities. And some of them are well known. We have coffee, cotton, timber, soy, other crops that are among the most consumed on Earth and have such a huge environmental footprint. We also have a very documented case of palm oil. It's a well-known example because they are grown in former swamps and drained aquatic systems and areas, and that production, we know it emits over 500 million tons of carbon dioxide every year, which is crazy. Maybe the latest numbers are even bigger. And it's what made actually Indonesia the third largest contributor to CO2 emissions after the US and China. So reducing that impact is very important. And impact finance can have a key role because the production and trading of these commodities, it requires heavy financing. And we know that the agricultural sector is responsible for the most need in financing. So it's actually not a difficult investment to make from a financial standpoint because of the relatively lower costs and little infrastructure requirements needed to begin production on these commodities compared to other industrial sectors. But when financial institutions, they began taking into account the impact that these sectors have and start having impact indicators, proper measurements of that impact, and they developed good practices for providing this financing in a more sustainable manner for the businesses, the stakeholders, and the local populations, but also for the ecosystems. Then they can have a very positive impact directly and indirectly. So why impact finance or sustainable finance needs to take into consideration the manufacturing, training, and retailing sector? It's even more important now because of the expansion of global markets. So the effect, they are not only felt locally, but whether they are positive or negative effects, of course, but they are felt worldwide. So when you bridge that financing gap and you provide sustainable financing that is applied to commodity trading, I'll give you an example. So I'm sorry because I didn't properly introduce myself earlier. I used to work in sustainable finance in an organization called the Finance Alliance for Sustainable Trade, and later with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity and UNDP as well. And I work with an NGO I helped co-found in Canada called CAP Développement Durable. It's CAP Sustainable Development. And we discuss a lot about these things. And when I used to work at FAST, we came up with kind of a nice way, because it was an alliance of different sustainable finance institutions that operated throughout the world, but that invest mainly in developing countries. And that solution to commodity trading, to make it more sustainable, was triangular impact finance. So that's when you involve the supplier, the buyer, and the financing counterpart all together into the same deal. So let's say you have an SME, a cooperative of producer, for example, that's the supplier, and needs financing to produce its commodity so that it can meet the buyer's requirements. We're not talking about microfinance and individual producers, we're talking about groups. So they require a little bit a higher trend of financing, which is within this financing gap. So that finance institution, what it can do, it can provide a loan against the purchase contract of the product from a buyer. So that contract, it acts as a guarantee, and the financial institutions can provide the loan to the producer to develop and grow its products, and it will be repaid in part by the buyer directly to the financial institution. So what happens in this case is that the financial institution, it holds a little bit all the cards, because by acting sustainably, it can add a number of criteria to provide its financing. Not only the economic ones, but it can ask for a more sustainable production value chain, more gender equality, more transparency in how the SME or the cooperative does its accounting, and also apply some certifications in terms of fair trade or ecological impact, and they ensure that proper attention is paid to the surrounding environment. So At the same time, it can make a fairer trading system and considerably reduce the environmental impact in the production and the trading process. So the buyer can also have some conditions applied to him for the buy, like for example, having a fair buying price at the market rates, because we know that most of these commodities that are traded worldwide now are within specific markets and are a little bit controlled. It can also be monitored on how it packages the product in an ecological way, and its code of conduct in terms of how it labels it to customers, etc., making sure that the local populations and the sources of origin are properly acknowledged, and so forth. So basically, what it comes down to is to have a proper set of indicators and conditions to provide this financing. And that goes beyond the traditional financing and economical considerations. So back at FAST, we used to work for, we had experience in facilitating such trading opportunities in Latin America and Eastern Africa, especially in Kenya and Tanzania. And we helped provide over $35 million to cooperatives and SMEs in sustainable commodity trading for products like coffee, cocoa, tea, sugar, sugarcane, and such. And what it made, how we made it a little bit more interesting is we organized financial fairs. So the cooperatives and SMEs, they would actually meet and negotiate with several different financial institutions at once, and then they would decide what was the best for them to partner with, because each of them, they had different scales in terms of how they wish to invest. Some of them wanted equity investment, so they had a little bit more control over how that company was growing and ensuring everything was done in a fair and equitable manner. Some of them, they invested more than others, so they had different rates. And some of them, they worked in specific trading of some commodities and not, so they had different indicators. So we helped them find kind of the right fit. And one of the most interesting aspects of this impact finance is the recovery rate. We mentioned earlier the difference that they can make, because first of all, they have very low interest rates. Impact finance institutions, they can offer loans with interest rates that are between 1% and 3% easily. And we worked with a lot of financial institutions who did that in most cases. And they also have a repayment rate that is over 95%, which is great when you compare it to other, the very large repayment default rates that microfinance sector has, for example, and they suffer from it, and especially in developing countries. So there are other ways to invest also. Apart from loans, you can offer capacity building with financial literacy. So basically what you're doing is you're helping your clients grow and become more sustainable businesses. And you can create partnerships through short-term equity finance. Basically, there are a lot of options, but another very interesting aspect to this kind of solution is something that Hervé pointed out right before, is that it's a great alternative to government subsidies, especially for the agricultural sector, because the governments of developing economies, they pump such a large amount of money and budgets in these subsidies to guarantee agricultural loan payments, to finance infrastructure, provide incentives. But it's, first of all, from an economic standpoint, it's not really that greatly efficient. That's what the numbers show. But also, most often, it's without any environmental concerns, and as Hervé pointed out, to the detriment of the environment. So impact finance with a solid set of sustainable indicators, if you apply it throughout the value chains and throughout the trading systems by bringing all the stakeholders, it can have a very positive impact, and that's what we call financing green, a greener type of financing.
Thank you, Mr. Ali. So this, as we see, impact investing is more general. I mean, it depends on what you are trying to impact. It could be gender issues. It could be on SME developments. But definitely, among all this impact investing, one of the most important is the environment. And I would like to give the floor to Mr. Fouad. And I would like to ask the same question, but from a more environmental finance perspective. What do you think that environmental finance will develop after COVID-19? What sort of solutions, recommendations do you have, especially for development finance institutions? Because ADFIMI type of institutions, development finance institutions, associations, are also looking for new policies to implement after COVID-19, and this could be new channels for them to develop new policies. What do you think on the environmental finance side after COVID-19, Mr. Fouad?
Thank you very much, Professor. I think you have touched upon a very important point here. What is the role of environmental finance in the post-COVID-19? So basically, I would look at it from two angles. The first angle is actually from the behavioral change angle, actually, because what happened during COVID-19 is that is a change is a behavioral change, is a change of actually of paradigm. We have seen the fears of some, people panic buying, stockpiling food, but also people panic selling to get rid of stocks or when the markets were plummeting. But we have also seen this collective capacity of many to adapt quickly and act together. As Hervé was mentioning, and Ali also was talking about, if governments together with civil society organizations, private sector counterparts, can come together to develop the right financial packages that are actually oriented towards environmental finance, that could be solving a lot of issues. We have seen this change in behaviors in terms of our capacity to act together and adapt quickly. We have seen social distancing, working from home, the surge of the use in new technologies and so on. These are very important and promising signs towards the change that can happen actually in the aftermath of COVID-19. We have also seen people shifting from negative practices that were used before, in terms of hygiene, food provision, mobility, shopping, the way they spend leisure, the way they go and, for vacation and so on. We have also seen decreased levels of pollution in major cities. We have seen wildlife in our streets. We have seen the dolphins back to the waters in the Bosphorus or the Mediterranean. So those are were all very promising signs that the change can happen, that if we all act together, if there's this behavioral change, we can also come and make it happen. Now, what I would like to say here is that the fact that we have proven ability to act together, we can flatten the curve of infection, so we can bend the curve of COVID-19. We can extrapolate the same thinking to our collective ability, which was questioned over decades, so we can flatten the curve, not of COVID-19, but of greenhouse gas emissions. So we can make sure we have the right mix of financial instruments and policies, so we can actually adapt to climate change, so we can change our behaviors, so we can reverse the loss of biodiversity and achieve land degradation neutrality and recognize the true value of our natural capital. So the behavioral change is very component. If there is any policy set up, if there is any stimulus package that is being developed, we should look at it from the behavioral insight kind of angle, because it's going to be very, very useful within the special circumstances post-COVID-19. Now, in terms of the package itself, I think we should resist the temptation to go back to the old normal, because it's not about rebuilding the economy the way it was before COVID-19, but it's really rebuilding an economy that is really different. We need to actually reboot our economies towards the carbon neutral future. We need to find the right mix again of policies and stimulus packages to phase out the use of fossil fuels in our economies, to rethink our food systems, the way we produce food. There is too much waste of food right now in the system as it is. We need to improve the way we govern our waters and oceans. We need to decarbonize our economies, to stimulate green investments, green jobs, invest in renewable energy. We have seen, for example, here in Turkey, where recently there was some work being done on starting to develop the first electric car actually in the country. We have seen actually efforts in some countries, and this needs to be encouraged in terms of how do we promote sustainable consumption and production patterns within the populations. How do we consume locally? How do we consume actually products that are environmental friendly? We need to rethink how do we build circular economies. We need to promote green jobs. instead of just randomly creating jobs, we can focus on creating green jobs, which add value to the economy, but at the same time preserve our very natural assets. We need to rethink tourism. If you look at countries all over the world right now, we have Hervé from Seychelles. We have the case of Turkey. We can talk about different other countries. Actually, the idea is not to get tourists back so they can book their hotels, you know, and start like doing activities and fueling the local economies. The idea is how do we get tourists back, but how do we build sustainable tourism actually models in all of our countries? We need to consider the use of nature-based solutions. Hervé works for Biofin, and you know they have this workbook solution with plenty of innovative ideas about financial solutions in the biodiversity field. So we need to put all these things in perspective so we can negotiate transition to sustainable economy. These options could be green fiscal policy options. For example, if a certain company would like to access like loans or recovery subsidies post COVID-19, the funding can be conditional if that company implements sustainability measures and has a checklist of criteria that defines environmental safeguards, for example. These are things that could be applicable by the members of ADFIMI and other development finance institutions. We have also like very good examples, the likes of the Natural Capital Declaration. This was a commitment by financial institutions to mainstream natural capital into the financial products, the packages they offer on the market, whether it's in terms of accounting, of disclosing like their environmental footprints and reporting frameworks regarding their environmental responsibility. So we need these kind of bold financial initiatives to integrate natural capital considerations into whatever financial scheme, be it loans, public or private equity, insurance products on the market, you name it. So we need to make sure that from now on we do things right, we capture the true value of natural capital, and all our financial products have somehow this dimension embedded within the package that, okay, if you get a loan, if you invest in equity, if you subscribe to an insurance product, that's fine. But we need also to make sure that whatever investment you are doing on the ground, these investments are environmental friendly. And one more idea I would like actually to emphasize on here is that we tend to look to the environment as being kind of, when we invest in the environment itself, it's used to be seen as somehow it's a lost investment, because when we talk about the environment, we usually tend to look at it from the angle of we conserve biodiversity and we protect the environment. But there is a missing articulation here, which is hugely important. It's the bioeconomy. If you invest your money in the bioeconomy, you can really have a very good return on investments, because so far we have seen many countries right now trying to tap into the unsaved potential of their bioeconomies. We can talk about blue economy. If you take countries like Seychelles or Rwanda, for example, part of their development strategies, they have emphasized a lot on biotechnologies that are applicable to marine, let's say, genetic resources in these countries. If we talk about wildlife economy in countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, or South Africa, we have seen that the parks were like in a very difficult situation after the revenue from tourism, actually, or ecotourism in this park stopped flowing after the COVID-19. And again, all these parks, their situation, their sustainability was put between brackets because simply put into simple terms, the local populations who used to derive revenue from the touristic activities related to the parks couldn't have these revenues anymore, and they're now like in a very difficult situation. They need to secure their livelihoods, which means there will be more threats and pressures on wildlife and on the resources of the park. The same thing could be said and applied to the case of Rwanda, of DRC Congo, and so on. So I think we are really at this crossroads where we have plenty of options, so we can reboot the way we do business, so we can reimagine the future, but this time we need to do it right to make sure that we don't have another COVID-19 showing up in the future, to make sure that finance, investments, and economy can go hand in hand with a sustainable development in general.
Thank you, Mr. Fouad. And from your talk, we see that there are very good examples, actually, not something that we start from scratch for after COVID-19 for good examples, but we have already some earlier experiences. And in the last round, we have about an hour so far, and we have 20 minutes to go, almost. We have, I guess we can do one last round. Let me take the point to Mr. Hervé. Could you give us some examples from or best practices examples from biodiversity financing? I know that you work in the field for a long period of time. You have great achievements in the field. You are one of the pioneers. To make it more concrete, more practical for development finance institutions, for the policymakers, could you give us some examples of the success in biodiversity that we can replicate probably after COVID-19?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think it will give me the opportunity to talk a bit more about this BioFin project. So it's started in 2012, and we are working in 35 countries worldwide. And we provide technical assistance to the countries who have expressed interest, and we help the country to identify, to quantify how much money they spend on biodiversity at national level from public, private sector, and civil society and donors. We help this country to quantify how much money do they need for biodiversity conservation. And finally, we try to identify a finance solution to reduce the financial gap identified at national level. So working with these 35 countries plus, we got what we call Biodiversity Finance Solution catalog that have been developed. And there's many options around the world. And I think our catalog, you can find it on Biodiversity Finance website, BioFin website. And there's list around 160 finance solutions that have been tested and used in different countries, in different parts of the world. And so it's a very broad list. Some target financial institutions, some target the private sector, some target the community, some target the public sector. So it's a very broad spectrum. Impact investment, it's one of them, but there's many, many others. Like for example, I will give some example from concrete example you want from countries. And after that, I want to focus a bit more on financial institutions, right? But for example, in Seychelles, we look at reforming the fiscal incentive for the tourism sector to make sure that fiscal incentive is aligned with sustainable tourism, which is not the case today. All right, so we will provide, for example, reduced business tax for any hotel having adopt a green label, all right, to make sure that the impact on the environment is very minimal. We're looking at issues to introduce in Seychelles biosecurity fees. Biosecurity, it's a mechanism to prevent the introduction of invasive species, which if it's introduced in an ecosystem, will degrade the biodiversity and can have a huge impact, all right? So we want to make sure that the system is financially sustainable. And to do that, we want to introduce a fee for the importers of goods to Seychelles, right? So that's one system. Another system we work in Seychelles, it's the debt nature swap. Seychelles have the huge level of debt, and they managed to restructure the debt with the support of financial institutions. And the restructuring of debt have created a flow of money, which is directed to a biodiversity conservation fund who finance conservation activity to support the blue economy. In Rwanda, they are developing a conservation trust fund. In Zambia, they are developing a green bond policy framework. In Kyrgyzstan, they are reforming subsidies to the agricultural sector, etc., etc. So, but to come back to the role of financial institution, the lesson learned is during the BioFin process is 2012, we didn't realize the importance of a financial institution. They were not on the map. They were not interested by biodiversity issues, not interested by climate change issues. It's only in the recent year they started to integrate the climate change issues and started to be more and more concerned, especially because of the risk it presents for the investment. As you know, you got climate risk, but now you got biodiversity risk. For example, a bank can lend money to a palm oil, all right? But on the balance sheet of a palm oil, they got pristine forest, and their strategy is to clear the forest to expand the palm oil production, all right? But now, in the situation of a post-COVID-19, it will not be possible to clear this extra piece of palm forest for palm oil. So it's a risk for the lender, all right? So the Dutch Central Bank just released last month a report to expose the risk of Dutch banks worldwide to biodiversity risk. And they flagged that you can Google online, by 500 billion euros of money lending by Dutch bank, it's exposed to biodiversity risk. And this opened the eye to many, many financial institutions. And many financial institutions now needs to work out a standard system to report biodiversity risk, and climate change risk is already been done, but biodiversity risk is not been done yet. And it's much more complex by climate risk to the financial institution. Climate risk is mostly CO2 emission, all right? But biodiversity is much broader. You need much more indicator, and you need metric system to be able to be accepted by the financial sector. So there's a huge role to play in financial institutions is to be part of a different working group existing in the world to contribute to this development of nature-related financial disclosure system that will need to be put in place, and many, many institutions are working on it now. Two, the financial institution need to, in their policy, to ensure that they adopt social and environmental safeguards, to make sure that the money they lend, it's only for businesses who produce positive impact on biodiversity, because we want at the end of the day to have a positive biodiversity outcome from businesses. And the financial institution has a key role by that, because they can refuse to lend money to a company that will produce negative impact on biodiversity. If it's integrated in investments, if the bank as well have an assessment of a risk exposed to biodiversity risk or climate risk as well. Thirdly, the main point from financial institution is that in many cases, for example, if I take the case of a debt nature swap, you need to partner with public institution. I think the way forward in this transition period to promote nature-based solution, it will be blended finance, which includes public money and money from the finance institution. You need the public money or from donor money to reduce the risk, because initially it will be a risk and it will be more expensive and the return will not be so great, all right? So to reduce this risk, to reduce the interest rate, you need to develop this mechanism of blending finance. And again, the financial institution, I think, have a key role to play this and to partner with the right public institution for that. I will stop here. I think that's in a nutshell some key points on the role to play. And it's a very exciting time to develop this post-COVID-19 framework that will integrate environment and biodiversity concern in the financial sector.
Yes, and exactly, we have lots of good examples at Biofin, starting back in 2012, you said, right? So these are things to replicate, probably more, even more after COVID-19. Thank you very much, Mr. Hervé. I will give the floor later on once more, very short period of time. But let me give Mr. Ali to the floor, or invite him to the floor, that reaching the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, through sustainable finance. What impact can be expected by greener finance sector? Mr. Ali.
Yeah, thank you. Our colleague Hervé has already touched on so many interesting points in how we can help finance institutions be more sustainable and the greener impact that they can have. And basically, I mean, in terms of the wide reach and ability to finance all kinds of businesses and projects for the finance sector, so sustainable finance can pretty much support in reaching all of the SDGs. If we look at the list of the 17 SDGs, a very interesting example that Hervé pulled out is the example of the Dutch. Indeed, there are many impact finance institutions and that come from the Netherlands, and that also have very strong concerns, environmental concerns, in terms of how they finance, and also the impact of that finance has in developing countries. We know you have institutions like Rabobank who do that exclusively with the agricultural sector. And one of the solutions that was done when they developed the indicators for climate change impacts was, like Hervé said, there is a heavy risk that accompanies these new types of considerations and conditions to investment. But a way that they partnered with the public sector, with the governments, is they reduced the risk by having a counterpart guarantee fund, a fund that came from governments that guarantees the loans that they do from a private sector perspective, because they're a private entity giving to SMEs or producer cooperatives in developing countries. It's a private partnerships, but these loans could be guaranteed by public sector. So instead of having much money in subsidies and bigger funds, they could have it in a more sustainable manner and help to guarantee these funds so that they encourage financial institutions to develop more sustainable indicators and to monitor better who they give money to through loans or equity investment and such. And that could be a very effective public-private partnerships in the way that Hervé described, this kind of how to make governments more into it. And when you develop these sustainable impact indicators or conditions for sustainable finance entities who can make this type of investments, they can do it and help support all of the SDGs. They can contribute to the fight against poverty by helping small business grow in developing countries. They create employment, they support local farmers, and they address the financing gap that we discussed earlier. So then that can also contribute to better health and well-being, which is also other SDGs, well-being of the stakeholders and the employees of the companies they invest in, but also to the local populations. Because, for example, one of the conditions, if you want to invest in a company, you can first be sure that all of the stakeholders have proper medical insurance as a condition to providing finance, for example. In terms of gender equity, you can have the empowerment of women and girls as a condition also. You create more gender balanced conditions in the business sector to provide this kind of financing, contribute to the education of children in those local communities that are affected by the company. And of course, you create job opportunities for the youth, because when you encourage, especially in developing countries, when you encourage investment in companies that operate in rural areas, for example, then it kind of stops the exodus towards big cities and help prevent issues with overpopulations and the deprivation of population from rural areas. And that helps to also kind of alleviate some of that impact. And of course, the reduction of environmental damage, if you finance with more eco-friendly business practices, especially for agricultural sector, help in reforestation. This was another example that Hervé touched upon, and that Fouad insisted on also earlier. You get rid of plastics, other bad products to encourage recycling, and basically you help in the fight against global warming, which is another SDG. The last one, you have goal 17 that specifically addresses the partnerships. We talked about public-private partnerships that can help doing that. So if we can support the lobbying of governments to boost this type of development financing and sustainable impact financing, it's definitely a way for the governments and the private sector to contribute to reaching the SDGs in general. And also, it's an open market that is worth trillions potentially. We have seen how much the finance gap is. So it's also a whole new sector in emerging economies that opened itself to the financial institutions. So they have a lot to gain by going greener in that sense.
Thank you, Mr. Ali. Let me give the again the last round to Mr. Fouad. Actually, I would like to ask the same question because I believe the importance of learning from the practice, and you are in the field. What sort of lessons have we learned to make our economy more resilient after COVID-19? What sort of practical examples could you provide us, please? Mr. Fouad, floor is yours with the examples. What sort of policy, what sort of practical examples that could be replicated to make the economy more resilient?
Thank you very much again for this question. It's really very important indeed. I will look into three main points actually as examples or as like good practices, takeaways from what happened recently actually in the field. First thing, it would go back to insist on the fact that it is big time today that we change the way we look at our natural capital and at environment in general. So if you are a development finance institution, if you are a private company, if you are a government, if you are a public entity, you need to look at the environment differently. And this is the conservation nexus valorization actually. So it's not, when you invest in the environment, you are not just conserving, you are not just protecting natural assets. You can also get a very good return on investments. Again, we have multiple examples. We can look at the potential of the blue economy. We can look at the potential of the wildlife economy. We can look at the potential of the genetic resources-based economy. If you take ylang ylang from the islands of Comoros, for example, when you export ylang ylang, you are not just exporting the flowers. You are not extracting the essentials of the flowers. What you're exporting is genetic information that could be used to innovate in the fragrance and perfume industry to develop products that are like worth perhaps millions of dollars in the market out there. If you are, let's say, exporting gum arabic from Sudan, you are not just exporting gum arabic, you are exporting again innovation that is contained in its genetic resource. And that innovation actually is worth so much more in terms of return on investment when it's used actually within the food and beverage industry. So we can mention many examples like that. So we need to look at the environment also as a promising fertile ground for investors, to engage with the environment, with the natural capital, and invest in the bioeconomy to have return on investments, while at the same time making sure that they are like using these resources sustainably. The second main takeaway I would say, or like example or like good practice, I think is it is great time, as Hervé was mentioning, as Ali was given the right examples as well. It is big time for all of us to look beyond just CSR, corporate social responsibility. We need to make sure that whatever we do, we don't just do it so we can be somehow environmentally, socially responsible, but we need to do it because now the clock is ticking. We are already beyond, we are like facing the wall. Today, most businesses, when they're doing like their investments, if they do a simple climate risk assessment, they will tick a lot of boxes and they will find themselves in the red, because simply you cannot control climate hazards anymore. You can have an influence on many things, but not on the climate hazards, for instance. So which means it makes perfect sense for everyone to team up and work together so we can do the right things. And to do that, I think we have a very good example from the vertical environmental fund. We'll look at the GCF, the Green Climate Fund. If we look at the GEF, the Global Environment Facility. These funds have been in the field for the last year and been doing tremendous work, helping countries actually manage their environmental assets, developing or producing environmental global environmental benefits. So it was a significant chunk of environmental finance, and it has really huge impact on the ground. And I think the lessons learned is that everyone needs to adopt the safeguards that Hervé was mentioning. Before having a project, before approving or financing or funding a project or putting a project on the table, we need to tick all the boxes. We need to do our due diligence. We need to make sure we understand what is the impact of the project on the environment. We need to run the environmental and social actually assessment. We need to understand what is the impact on gender equality, what is the impact of on the livelihoods of the local communities, have some sort of stakeholder engagement plan. So these are like all very important boxes we need to take in. And the third point before concluding is that I think we couldn't hope for a better opportunity like this one, because one of the main challenges before, you have followed any of the conference of the parties to negotiate, for example, climate change agreements, you will see delegates from countries negotiating day and night, over days and days, over weeks, and still not being able to come up together with a common agreement. What we have seen during the COVID-19 is this exceptional ability under special circumstances to come up together and work together towards a common objective. So let's use this momentum. Let's build on this momentum. Let's use this common ability that we somehow rediscovered again thanks to COVID-19. Let's look at it as an opportunity so we can build back better this time.
Exactly. So sometimes the crisis actually sharpen our understanding, and I guess COVID-19 has made it. Environmental issues have been around, and as you rightly mentioned, even in many conferences, they don't even agree the existence of the problem before getting into the solutions, even though there is not much of an agreement on the issue. But this sort of COVID-19 issue probably is making that there's a problem in the rest of the world. So it is the right time, definitely, to do the reform. So the crisis sometimes brings us the reform, and I hope we will appreciate. Definitely, we have to look at the optimistic side, and I hope this will trigger new chain of reactions for better. Before I end the session, is there any questions from the floor? We are a bit over time, but if there is any questions, you may ask now or later to our speakers. I know that they are quite friendly, and I'm sure they will answer your questions, not just now, but later also. Let me give the floor to Mr. Hervé to say his last words. If there's any questions, I will ask in the remaining 3 minutes. Let's say, or let's give 1 or 2 minutes to each of the speakers, and then I will close. Mr. Hervé, would you like to add something, especially for development finance institutions? Because, I mean, we are all learning, and but at the same time, we should act at some point. The learning is not just enough. We should act for the betterment of the world. So what is your suggestion, your last, in the last round?
Yeah, a few words. As you know, probably know, 2020 was supposed to be the superstar year for biodiversity, because it was supposed to be the convention on biological diversity. It was supposed to be held in Benryane. And it's a key meeting because it was supposed to define the next targets, objective of a convention for the next decade, for 2020, 2030. Now with the COVID-19, most partners in the world, financial institutions, realize the linkage between nature, pandemic, and economic crisis. And so it will be interesting to follow up. There is a key component on sustainable financing under that convention. And I think invite any financial institution to join this convention, because it will define the objective of the next decade, and it will be crucial because I don't think we can wait one more decade. We need to have concrete results in terms of positive biodiversity outcome very soon, as well as climate change. And both of them are very linked, and it's very important to contribute to this international process.
Hopefully it will be so. Thank you very much again for joining and for your very, very valuable contribution. And we will follow the Biofin with the achievements, with the good examples. Let me turn to Mr. Ali. What are your key messages in the last round? Just in one or 2 minutes, please.
Yes, I mean, thank you so much for this opportunity to share on this very important topic. The main message is for sustainable issues and a sustainable future for our planet and for ourselves more so. Financial institutions, they have a key role to play, and by changing a little bit the approach, it can not only be a more sustainable manner of acting with all of these considerations that take into account not only climate change, biodiversity issues, but also a lot of social issues that need addressing. But the solutions are not that far. Something that's interesting that Fouad mentioned is all of these people, we are used to it. We used to participate in the conferences of parties, the COPs, where a lot of delegates, they keep negotiating to come to these solutions and these international treaties. You need to be a part of that conversation. You need to participate because you have the solutions. Financing is a key to develop a lot of different aspects to the economy. So working together by developing the proper indicators, understanding the risks, developing partnerships to reduce the risks, it can not only be a huge benefit to humanity and to the planet as a whole, but also create huge economic opportunities because there is a lot of untapped potential. There is a lot of gap to be bridged, financing gap. And the trillions of needs that are there, they're going to have to come from some people. So financial institutions could step up, open a little bit their horizons, adapt a little bit of their products, their financing products and services, and hopefully they can contribute to a more sustainable future for the planet.
I completely agree. I mean, it's not just about the environmental issues, but it is about the economic impact. It is not something like a principle-based thing, but there is an actual output by giving more emphasis to environmental finance, environmental issues. Mr. Ali, thank you very much for your very valuable contributions. I guess we will continue discussing these issues and it will be even much more important. Thank you very much again. And last but not least, again, Mr. Fouad, thank you very much for your contribution. What are your last words before we conclude?
Very quickly, key message to the development finance institutions. We cannot do it without you. If we are to achieve the SDGs, we need all hands on deck. We need everyone's help. As Hervé mentioned, next year, actually, because of the COVID issue, actually everything was postponed to 2021. It's going to be a super mega year for biodiversity and climate change. So keep an eye on what's going on. There is the post 2020 actually biodiversity agenda or like framework that is being developed. We're going to be seeing a lot of very interesting developments. So keep an eye on this discussion. Dialogue is very interesting, so we can all like work together hand in hand so we can make sure we build back better after COVID-19.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Fouad. Definitely, we will keep an eye on environmental finance, impact investing, biodiversity finance. Definitely, we are much more aware now, and we will be even more alert about the conferences, events, and we recommend our development finance institutions to do the same because the business as usual is changing, and we have to expand our horizon of how to do development financing, and these are the areas that seems to have a future. So again, I would like to thank you all. I would like to thank all of our panelists for their very distinguished speeches, and we will continue watching you. We have an eye on you as well about what you do, your new projects. Thank you very much for being with us. And I would like to also thank all the participants. And I would like to thank the ATFIMI for organizing such an event. It was a really a pleasure for me to moderate the session. I greatly learned, and I will continue to learn more in the upcoming events. Again, thank you very much, and hope to have similar events in the future.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much. See you all soon. All the best.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.